From his usual position, Yonezawa observed in silence. Staring out the window was one of his most ingrained habits. He felt that by doing so he could momentarily detach himself from a reality that to him was a monotonous and predictable routine. However, something had begun to change over the past few days. Gradually his attention drifted from the outside scenery to the girl sitting next to him, a quiet woman who inexplicably was beginning to capture his interest. Hachiya Kirei was the girl he had met. In the new school term, fate had placed them in the same class. What struck him most was her ease with makeup application in front of the class, despite the stairs she had to climb. This surprised him. On more than one occasion, he wondered why girls chose to dress so strikingly, and whether watching them get ready diminished the magic. Despite this, Hachiya calmly brushed on mascara, as if time had no effect on her. She stood up from her seat with a determined gesture. Yonezawa, intrigued, followed her gaze from his desk. To his surprise, she walked over, leaned in slightly and placed her makeup pouch on his desk, invading his personal space. Yonezawa could barely react. He opened his eyes wide in a mix of surprise and discomfort, and clumsily managed to mutter a hesitant, "Go ahead." In contrast, Hachiya maintained a calm expression. There was no trace of provocation or embarrassment. Without another word, she sat on his desk, turning her back to him while he remained stiff, watching her in silence. As the days went by, that routine became a habit. Every morning Hachiya would take that spot to do her makeup, utilizing the morning light coming through the window. It was apparent that from her seat, the shadow of her body made it difficult to see her hands clearly. Consequently, without asking for permission, she simply settled where it was most comfortable for her. Yonezawa, resigned, knew that from that position he could no longer see outside. Instead, he observed how she applied her makeup, without concern for others' judgment or the aesthetics of the moment. Each day she seemed to apply more product around her eyes with an intensity that left him wondering whether that process had any limits. Then the teacher entered the classroom and asked everyone to take their seats. From his spot, Yonezawa continued to watch Hachiya. He wondered with a certain curiosity what was going on with that girl who seemed incapable of acting like the rest. Amidst his thoughts, the teacher announced a physical examination would be held in the afternoon. At that moment, Yonezawa noticed a pleasant scent in the air. He sniffed lightly and realized why. Hachiya had taken out her bento and was already eating in the middle of class. She chewed calmly, making no effort to conceal it. Yonezawa muttered to himself that she was eating during homeroom. As he looked at her food, he thought it was all chunks of meat with bones. He wondered if it was Christmas, or what she could possibly be celebrating. She attempted to cover the bento with her textbook, but it was obvious anyone could see it. A bone even protruded from her mouth, as she continued chewing with puffed-out cheeks. The teacher, upon noticing, pointed at her firmly and demanded an explanation. Hachiya looked at him without replying, her gaze intense and locked on his eyes. From his seat, Yonezawa watched as the teacher scolded her, while she, with her mouth still full, shot him a look filled with contempt. He thought that if she was already on the teacher's radar on the very first day, he could not imagine how she expected to survive the next 2 years. The teacher, visibly upset, ordered her to go to the teacher's office after class. Despite a small drop of sweat running down her cheek, she remained silent. Yonezawa believed the scolding would cause her distress. However, she lifted her head firmly and met the teacher's eyes, openly defying him. The teacher appeared momentarily frozen, before slowly turning his face towards her. Yonezawa, now sweating, was struck by how incredibly free Hachiya was. When lunchtime arrived, the classroom atmosphere became more relaxed. Nevertheless, a few classmates began whispering to each other, casting furtive glances in Hachiya's direction. They claimed she had begun eating in the middle of class and had glared at the teacher with an expression of hostility. While they acknowledged her beauty, they also clearly stated she was frightening. Ultimately, they concluded that it would be best not to invite her to anything. Yonezawa realized it immediately. They were already beginning to fear her. Faced with a dilemma, he opened his lunch bag to find it brimming with onigiri and decided to eat. However, at that moment, he felt someone's gaze fixed on him. Hachiya-san was staring intently. Nervously, he turned his head and asked if she was all right. To his surprise, she looked puzzled, touching her chin as if he were the odd one out. Yonezawa couldn't fathom why she was surprised. From their desks, her gaze was clearly directed at his food. He began to suspect. Perhaps, he thought, since she'd already finished her own, she was now interested in his. Her audacity was undeniable. In disbelief, he offered her one of his aneri. He figured the whole situation was somewhat amusing, and casually mentioned an anigiri wasn't a big deal. She took the food without hesitation, and bit into it with both hands, a look of satisfaction bordering on childlike. Yonezawa watched her blush slightly, as she continued to eat with delight, seemingly unconcerned. In that moment, he realized Hachiya-san truly lived in the moment, 100%, and it made him feel a bit envious, though he'd never want to be like that himself. She wiped her mouth calmly, her face relaxed, and a faint smile playing on her lips. Then, with bright eyes and cheeks flushed, she looked at him innocently. Yonezawa was once again at a loss. He noticed her gaze again, and lowered his eyes to his own bento, wondering if she'd take that too. He couldn't help but wonder how much this girl could possibly eat. He turned to her with a straightforward question. He reminded her they'd have body measurements later, and asked if it was okay to eat so much. Despite appearing surprised, she didn't look away from Yonezawa's onigiri, a small amount of drool escaping her mouth as she savored the onigiri she still held. This behavior was revealing to Yonezawa. He'd always believed she only thought 1 second ahead, never pausing to consider anything beyond that. However, as he continued to observe her more closely, his perception began to shift. Seeing her with that carefree expression made everything seem absurdly silly. While Yonezawa began to consider that perhaps the problem was not hers at all, but himself. He had long decided that reality was boring. Then he came to an uncomfortable conclusion. He was just as foolish as she was. And to make matters worse, he had not even eaten his own. Time slipped by unnoticed until it was already afternoon. In the classroom, the teacher stood at the front, distributing papers and explaining that he was returning the results of the physical exam. The usual atmosphere prevailed until he called Hachiya forward. She stood and walked towards him, while the other students continued their work. However, as she received her exam, Hachiya lowered her head, her face obscured by her hair, and her body tensed noticeably. Yonezawa noticed this immediately and felt something was amiss, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Without warning, Hachiya dashed out of the classroom through the back door. The teacher reacted too late, shouting for her to stop and asking where she was going, but she had already disappeared down the hallway. Yonezawa felt a strange pressure in his chest, though he couldn't understand it. As he grew older, he pressed his lips together and looked away, trying to convince himself it wasn't his concern, and there was no reason to worry about the girl sitting next to him. He kept repeating to himself that he shouldn't get involved, over and over, until he almost believed it. But the memories wouldn't leave him alone. Images of Hachi eating came rushing back, showing her face with puffed-out cheeks repeatedly. He looked down, caught between his thoughts and his feelings. He was already standing up from his seat. Without thinking too much, Yonezawa decided to check on Hachiya. The teacher, somewhat surprised by his initiative, barely managed a nervous okay as the student hurried towards the door. He ran through the school hallway, the memories still vivid in his mind. The image of Hachi, just as she had been only minutes before, kept replaying. Although she usually acted at her own pace, this time her behavior was undeniably strange. He saw her entering another part of the building and was certain it was her. He assumed she was heading to the rooftop, and sure enough, there she was. Hachiya was lifting her sweater, exposing her stomach. Nerves gripped Yonezawa, and he could only think about her belly. Confused, he watched as she pressed her abdomen with both hands. From another angle, the image became clearer. Her stomach compressed slightly as her clothes stretched. Hachiya pressed again, this time with more force, and finally her belly returned to its natural shape. She smiled, her eyes closed as if the whole thing was just a silly game. In that instant, Yonezawa realized she was truly playing. However, quite suddenly, Hachiya seemed to snap back to reality. Becoming aware of her actions, she murmured that it had returned. Her face changed, showing clear discomfort. Lowering her head, her expression grew dull and lifeless. That's when Yonezawa understood. She was crying. He brought a hand to his mouth as he watched her in silence. Hachiya lifted her face just slightly and their eyes met in that brief instant. He was completely frozen. He knew they had looked directly at each other. She reacted immediately. Turning sharply, her face burned with embarrassment and visible irritation. Yonezawa, for his part, partially covered his own face with one hand, as if trying to become invisible. He kept telling himself he hadn't done anything, that he hadn't even looked at her stomach. Then Hachiya raised her hand forcefully, as if about to speak. She approached him purposefully, her face leaning towards him with flushed cheeks and an intense expression that made the gravity of the moment clear. Firmly, she declared that what had just happened was a secret. Without waiting for a response, she turned on her heel and hurried away. As if escaping, Yonezawa tried to stop her, but it was too late. He stood there, confused, unable to comprehend what had just transpired. From the outside, the school building looked just the same as always, with a clock marking the passage of time. Yet, in his mind, everything felt different. He knew the incident had deeply affected him. Later, when he returned to the classroom, the teacher was waiting for him, with a clearly displeased expression, leaning on the desk. Yonezawa entered without a word and sat down. His gaze instinctively turned towards the window. He had always enjoyed looking outside. It helped him clear his mind and escape the dull reality he found so monotonous. This time, however, something was different. He looked up and saw her. Hachiya was leaning on his desk, her hands on her cheeks, blushing and looking at him intently. That's when he realized he should start looking more inside the classroom. From that moment on, the days that used to feel the same began to gain some color. Meanwhile, the teacher took attendance and reviewed homework. At one point he called Yonezawa by name. Yonezawa slowly looked up. His head was still full of thoughts, overwhelmed by the impact of the day before. Irritated, the teacher asked if he hadn't slept well. Yonezawa offered a slight apology, feeling a bit embarrassed. The teacher didn't press further, and simply asked him to read page 17 of the textbook. Yonezawa sat with the book open, but couldn't focus. His mind was elsewhere, and the vivid images from the previous day lingered. Although Hachiya hadn't given the incident much importance, he couldn't shake the feeling that it had been strange. He even doubted whether she truly recognized him. It seemed unlikely she'd actually noticed him until that moment. When class ended, Yonezawa left the room. Like so many others recently, he hadn't been able to concentrate and felt the need to regain his focus. So he decided to stay and study a bit before heading home. He thought about stopping by a cafe to eat something and clear his mind. However, as soon as he entered, he froze. Hachiya was sitting at a table, eating breaded shrimp again. He couldn't help but stop and stare at her, incredulous that she was seriously eating after school. A waitress approached him and asked if he'd like to order. Yonezawa, standing next to Hachiya's table, responded nervously. He mumbled a few words, unsure of what to say. In the end, they both ended up sitting at separate tables. As he browsed the menu, Yonezawa felt a fixed gaze on him. When he glanced up briefly, he noticed she was watching him silently. He raised his hand to call the waitress and ordered something. The tension in the air was unmistakable. The situation was undoubtedly awkward. Distracted by his thoughts, he returned to reading the menu, avoiding too much focus. He ordered a coffee jelly. Wanting to avoid her, he just needed a bit of sugar to study. His plan was simple: study for an hour, then go home. However, he soon felt a piercing gaze on him. Hachiya was staring directly from her table. When she realized he'd noticed, she let out a faint swallow, her body tense. Yonezawa realized what was happening. She was eyeing his coffee jelly. He took a spoonful, trying to convince himself sugar was essential for studying, but Hachiya wouldn't stop staring. She swallowed repeatedly, her body rigid. Fear began to creep in. Her reaction seemed far too intense. The constant wet sound of her swallowing became almost tangible, invading the space between them. It was impossible to ignore. A clear, annoyed thought formed in his mind. He reminded himself they were still in school uniforms, making it even more inappropriate. Involuntarily, he compared the sound to someone chugging beer straight from a mug. Then he realized something else. Hachiya didn't even seem aware of her craving. She was visibly struggling. Yonezawa watched her intently, as a bead of sweat trickled down his face. He then reached a decisive conclusion. The only one capable of resolving this was himself. With determination, he approached Hachiya and urged her to open her mouth. Surprised, she did not quite comprehend what was happening. Just before the spoon entered her mouth, she swallowed and let out a nearly inaudible sigh, exhaling slowly. Her expression gradually shifted. Her face relaxed, taking on a calm and happy appearance as she rested her hands on her cheeks with visible satisfaction. Seeing her like that, Yonezawa felt an unexpected sense of relief. He then placed some money in a nearby glass, picked up his backpack, and simply stated he was leaving. As he walked away, he thought resignedly that he would not be able to study in this manner. However, just then, he felt someone grasp his arm. It was Hachiya. She looked up at him with a sincere expression and thanked him for the food. Yonezawa's face flushed slightly. A clear thought then surfaced. She had remembered him. Later, the scene shifted to the sports field. The teacher announced that today's physical fitness test would begin with the handball throw for the girls. Hachiya, already dressed in her gym clothes, held the ball in her hands. From a distance, Yonezawa watched her silently, wondering if she was good at sports. Finally, Hachiya threw the ball with force. However, after a brief pause, the teacher stated neutrally that the distance was 0. Yonezawa thought Hachiya was completely useless. For her part, Hoya brought a hand to her head with a confused expression. Just as another classmate announced the next test would be the grip strength test, Yonezawa reflected that given Hachiya's imposing presence, her strength should be considerable. However, when he saw her squeezing the device with intense effort, the gauge barely registered 12 kilograms. At that moment, Yonezawa realized she was truly weak. He adjusted his glasses and sweat dripped down his forehead, anticipating the flexibility assessment. When Hachiya attempted a stretch, she only managed 2 centimeters, surprising Yonezawa with her stiffness. He watched her silently, wondering if she was simply bad at sports. Shortly after the teacher announced the shuttle run, Yonezawa hoped she might perform better. As the signal sounded, Hachiya began to turn, but her abdomen was clearly visible. Keeping his eyes forward. Suddenly she stumbled clumsily on the track and collapsed, as if all her strength had vanished. Just then a ball flew towards him, and someone shouted a warning. Before he could react, the ball struck him directly in the face. While Yonezawa covered his face, one of his friends shouted. Embarrassed, they scolded him for being so distracted. Another comment followed mockingly suggesting he had been staring too hard at Hachiya. Yonezawa awkwardly denied it, thinking it was not like that. The conversation shifted when one of the boys mentioned Jairus and suggested Yuzuki was more his type. Curious, Yonezawa repeated the name, and they pointed to the girl standing next to Hachiya. A group of students had gathered around a figure sprawled on the ground, dramatically spread out like a splatter. Seeing her, Yonezawa wondered if she was melting, but then realized it was Hachiya. Yonezawa deduced she'd probably run out of energy due to hunger. Some students whispered she'd lost interest and simply decided to lie down, calling her behavior arrogant. Others commented on the uncomfortable situation. Then a pretty and confident girl stepped in naturally, explaining there was no need to worry, it happened often. Despite his initial skepticism, Yonezawa couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Seeing the scene unfold, the PE teacher reacted with alarm, gesturing and asking what was happening. Even considering the possibility of illness, he immediately ordered someone to take her to the nurse's office. However, another student suggested Yonezawa help. From behind, Yonezawa protested, but the teacher had already made up his mind and given him the task. He told the rest of the class to return. In silence, a bead of sweat trickled down his face as he walked over to Hoya. He noticed she weakly raised her hands from the ground as if pleading for help. Lying on her back with her arms outstretched towards him, her expression was vacant, cheeks flushed, and her eyes glassy. She was barely responsive. Yonezawa watched her, nervous and sweating, realizing he'd have to lift her alone. Hachiya remained motionless with her arms outstretched and unfocused gaze. When no one helped her sit up, she began moving on her own, making small effort sounds. Yonezawa finally understood and stepped closer. He took her hands and pulled her up, exerting a great effort. Even so, Hachiya barely reacted. Yonezawa felt her weight fall on him and couldn't help but suspect deep down that perhaps she simply wanted pampering. After everything, he found himself standing in a store in front of the counter. As he selected a few items, he thought he'd already bought lunch. That thought slipped away every time he recalled what had happened when he returned to class. Something had changed. To his surprise, there were more gal-style girls than usual. As he entered the classroom with a bag in hand, he immediately realized his seat no longer belonged to him. At that moment, a blonde girl with an exaggerated smile was applying makeup to Hachiya, who remained still, allowing the other to do her work. Both of them noticed his presence at nearly the same time. Without showing any emotion, Yonezawa extended his arm and offered what he had brought, accompanied by a simple question. He asked Hachiya if she wanted that for today and handed her the food he had bought. She accepted it without hesitation and immediately began eating with clear delight. Her enthusiasm was so obvious that it appeared as though she was devouring 2 onigiri at once. Meanwhile, Yuzuki, the blonde girl, watched them in surprise. Her eyes focused on Hachiya, and she wondered whether someone other than her was feeding tea. Her expression immediately shifted. The intensity of her gaze intensified as she fixed Yonezawa directly. Without hesitation, she asked him point-blank who he was. Yonezawa, visibly uncomfortable, replied briefly, introducing himself without further ado. However, he could not help but feel that the girl was already seated in his seat without permission and was now acting completely familiar. Far from backing down, Yuzuki introduced herself with a confident smile, stating her name was Hai Yuzuki, and firmly clarifying that she and Hachiya had been together since kindergarten. She reminded him of this fact. From that moment, a subtle tension filled the air. Yuzuki stared at him with hostility, while he maintained a reserved attitude, avoiding confrontation. That is when Yuzuki faced him directly. She had observed him feeding Hachiya quite confidently, and asked what his relationship with her was. Yonezawa responded seriously, stating it was nothing special. However, Yuzuki did not appear satisfied. She pressed further, asking if he had ever given Hachiya anything carbonated. Yonezawa, maintaining a straight face, replied, "No, never." At that, Yuzuki reacted with surprise as if confirming her point. She stated that then he clearly did not know Hachi disliked carbonated drinks so much that they could even make her cry. Yonezawa remained silent, not responding. She wanted to know if he had ever pushed Hachiya on a swing, implying that Hachiya could not swing by herself. A little uneasy, Yonezawa admitted that he had not had the chance. Yuzuki smiled, visibly pleased with his answer, and was about to continue, but Yonezawa interrupted her. In a firm voice, he simply pointed out that the seat where she was sitting was his. Yuzuki reacted with surprise, looking at him from where she sat. Her expression changed immediately. She questioned whether that was indeed his seat, and then posed a new inquiry. Had he approached Hachiya with ulterior motives? Yonezawa regarded her seriously, unshaken, and pondered how she had arrived at that conclusion. Yuzuki, touching her chest, fell silent for a moment as if reflecting. Then in a low voice, she murmured a simple, "Wow," as if reconsidering her words. Her face re-answered slightly, and she whispered that in that case, this was still her privilege. She let out a deep sigh, releasing the tension that had built up. At that moment, Yuzuki leaned towards Hachiya and hugged her warmly, a gesture sincere and full of affection. Hachiya, for her part, could not help but blush. Meanwhile, Yonezawa watched the scene in silence, feeling uncomfortable as he considered the nature of such interactions between girls. Hachiya remained seated next to Yuzuki, the two of them very close. In silence, they both looked at Yonezawa, the protagonist, their faces slightly flushed. Without speaking, Hachiya's face showed a calm expression, though marked by slight tension. She remained silent, but in her gaze there was a subtle mixture of tenderness and emotional restraint. At that moment, Yonezawa felt her eyes on him, and surprised, he turned around. However, he quickly looked away, unsettled, silently asking himself what that expression had meant. He insisted to himself that he had done nothing. It was then that from the back of the classroom, Yuzuki's voice abruptly broke the silence. She announced that the next class would be held in the gymnasium. This interrupted the moment between Yonezawa and Hachiya. With a playful tone and a flirtatious pose, Yuzuki turned to Yonezawa with a smile, and told him she had left his seat warm. However, Yonezawa remained silent, showing no reaction to her comment. Just as they were about to leave, an unexpected event occurred. Yonezawa took Hachiya's hand, and without saying much handed her something. The gesture caught her completely off guard. When she opened her hand, Hachiya saw it was a piece of chocolate. Meanwhile, Yuzuki urged her along, warning that it was time to change clothes, and that if she continued to be distracted, they would be late for class. In that moment, Hachiya abruptly stopped, without thinking. Yuzuki brought the chocolate to her mouth, and ate it. Her face lit up with a simple kind of happiness, a change from her usual expression. Yuzuki, seeing her, was stunned. She asked what was going on, remarking it was the first time she had ever seen that face on her. She noted that, even if subtle, there was something different in Hachi's expression. Finally, she asked what she was eating. The scene shifted again. From outside the school building was shown, marking the arrival of the long-awaited lunch break. Yuzuki raised her hand and cheerfully called out to Hachiya, suggesting they go eat on the rooftop. However, Hachiya remained silent. She lowered her gaze and, without saying anything, stared directly at Yonezawa. Seeing this, Yuzuki looked at her in confusion, wondering if Hachiya actually wanted to have lunch with Yonezawa. As she walked, she reflected in silence, recalling the previous day when she had misunderstood Hachiya and impulsively acted on that. That scene still made her feel guilty. Now she understood she had to respect Hachiya's wishes, to be more understanding. In her mind, she pictured the captain of the soccer club, and imagined herself beside him, telling herself with determination that if she did not change, she would never become her senpai's girlfriend. Yuzuki raised her voice and called out to Yonezawa energetically, asking him to wait. A little later, the three of them, Hachiya, Yuzuki and Yonezawa, were sitting together for lunch. The atmosphere was peaceful. Hachiya sat very close to Yonezawa, showing no sign of discomfort. For his part, he thought that eating together was not so bad. Although he quietly admitted to himself that he had only brought food for one, Yuzuki held up her lunchbox and declared there was nothing to worry about that day. Her mother had made Hachiya's lunch. Yonezawa simply replied that if that was the case, then it was fine. He said nothing more. Yuzuki's eyes shone with intensity. Mentally, she declared with conviction that her lunch was a declaration in itself. A double-layered bento box, filled with gleaming, carefully arranged fried chicken. That day lunch at home was one thing and one thing only: fried chicken stacked in 2 full layers. Yuzuki thought with fierce determination that she would fill Hachiya's stomach so much there would be no room for anything else. She was sorry, but her goal was not just to feed her. She wanted to make Yonezawa feel the sting of defeat. Meanwhile, Yonezawa remained calm, his expression unchanged. He casually took out his own lunchbox. Inside was yakisoba. Simple noodles, but well prepared. He began adding mayonnaise to them, as if none of this affected him in the slightest. Hachiya watched in silence, saying nothing. Her face remained calm, but her eyes were fixed on Yonezawa's food. Though she did not speak, it was obvious she was paying absolute attention. That was when Yuzuki noticed the scene. Internally she was jolted. She could not believe Hachiya was staring so intensely at a simple stream of mayonnaise. Seeing this, she looked back down at her own lunch. She remembered then that fried chicken was without doubt Hachiya's favorite food. That was why she could not afford to lose. However, the unexpected happened. Hachiya snatched the lunch straight out of her hands. Yuzuki was left frozen, feeling a mix of resignation and certainty. Deep down she thought she had always known. Hachiya preferred Yonezawa's food. However, that assumption dissolved in seconds. To her surprise, Hachiya did not keep the food for herself. She brought her bento close to Yonezawa's, and without saying a word, began mixing the contents of both lunches. Holding her chopsticks, she combined the ingredients with total ease, completely ignoring the astonished faces around her. Yonezawa looked at her, baffled, still not fully understanding what that gesture meant. Meanwhile, Yuzuki was falling apart inside. She had mixed everything, she could barely react. Muttering in disbelief that her beloved fried chicken had been absorbed by the yakisoba. Next to her, Yonezawa shared the same feeling. In a low voice, his eyes blank, he appeared somewhat distressed, as his yakisoba had also disappeared in the fusion. Hachiya, however, remained completely unfazed. She held her chopsticks tightly and fixed her gaze on the food. With complete seriousness and without hesitation, she was ready to eat and began enthusiastically slurping up the noodles. Her loud slurping indicated her hunger. Yonezawa attempted to intervene, perhaps to point out her actions or speak, but he was unable to do so. In a few seconds, the container was completely empty. Then, Hachiya paused as if snapping out of a trance. She opened her eyes, surprised by her actions, and with a sweet, slightly embarrassed expression, touched her lips with a finger, and lowered her voice. She admitted she had not considered the consequences. Yuzuki had consumed everything. She looked down, overwhelmed with guilt. She had assumed this had occurred solely because she had suggested the three of them eat together. Perhaps that had not been such a sound idea after all. However, Yonezawa viewed the situation differently. He felt it was not something to be upset about. If someone could eat with such eagerness and sincerity to the point of making everything seem more delicious, then perhaps that had value too. From his perspective, it deserved respect. Yuzuki watched him quietly, wondering if deep down Yonezawa had a greater heart than he let on. Still with a small amount of food in her mouth, looked at both of them. Her expression was a mixture of tenderness, embarrassment, and calm. Although she did not speak, her gestures conveyed her message. The three of them remained seated together. Then in a more relaxed tone, Yuzuki offered Yonezawa some of the food left at the bottom of her bento. He was somewhat surprised to accept without much confidence, and thanked her for the gesture. Hachiya remained silent as usual. Yuzuki turned to her, and with a mixture of scolding and affection, pointed out that she still had food in her mouth. Despite lunch being somewhat chaotic and perhaps wild, they all shared it amicably. The story then shifted to Kujiu, Yonezawa's childhood friend, who had been contemplating the changes he had noticed in him recently. Kujiu recalled seeing Yonezawa as indifferent, reserved, and unaffected by others or his surroundings. However, recently something had changed. Yonezawa seemed to be showing interest in Hachiya, the well-known gal girl. Kujiu, who had known Yonezawa since primary school, had never really known anything about his romantic life. Yonezawa did something completely unexpected. He approached Kujiu and asked for a favor. He specifically asked Kujiu to help some girls with their studies, saying it almost nonchalantly. However, to Kujiu, it was completely out of character. After all, Yonezawa wasn't the type to ask for favors. Kujiu was left puzzled by his acting. He was quite clever, and it's likely why Yonezawa approached him. Everything that happened made him think. Yuzuki appeared concerned as she held several low-scoring tests and showed them to Kujiu. She explained that if Hachiya failed the year, they would be separated, and that she could not allow this to happen. Shortly afterwards, the four of them were gathered in the library. Yonezawa, Kuji, Yuzuki, and Hachiya sat together. Surrounded by books, they attempted to study as a group. Kuji observed the scene with a mix of curiosity and amusement. From his perspective, the situation was becoming interesting. Driven by his inquisitive nature, Kuji could not hold back a direct question. He wanted to know if Hachiya had a boyfriend. Yuzuki's reaction was immediate. She glared at him with clear hostility and fired back with a question of her own. Why did he want to know? Kuji, unfazed, answered calmly. He said he was simply wondering what kind of relationship Yonezawa and Hachiya had. Far from clarifying anything, that response only confused Yuzuki further. Kuji then decided to explain his point more clearly. He stated that Yonezawa had never shown interest in anyone. He was an individual who lived at his own pace, uninvolved in others' affairs, which made him easy to get along with. However, since Hachiya began sitting next to him, something had begun to change. According to Kuji, Yonezawa was beginning to show signs of humanity, as if gradually becoming more gentle, somewhat puzzled, unsure of what he meant. At that moment, Kuji recalled Yonezawa's behavior during junior school. He was much more serious, locked in his own world, distant from everything. Taking advantage of this moment of honesty, Yuzuki pointed out that Hachiya had also changed recently. She had noticed small new details. Her skin appeared more radiant, her scent more pleasant. Her eyelashes seemed longer, and her eyes sparkled with more intensity. It was as if she was radiating a special aura. Kuji murmured a single word with a reverent tone. Pheromones. This was when Yonezawa interrupted them, firmly scolding them to stop talking and focus on studying. Kuji, a little embarrassed, apologized immediately. However, something else caught his attention. Hachiya was completely unmotivated. Slumped in her chair, she drooped like a lifeless sack, a pencil dangling from her nose, as if her mind was miles away. It was evident she had no intention of studying at all. Kuji could barely contain his laughter at the sight. Yuzuki also burst out laughing. The two of them watched her amused, as Kuji whispered that Hachiya had completely lost the will to go on. Yuzuki, still laughing, confirmed that her expression was a complete disaster. Suddenly, Yonezawa raised his voice, shouting at Hachiya to wake up. Noticing that she had fallen asleep, the pen slipped from her hand as she leaned forward and fell asleep quickly. Calmly, Yonezawa approached her and pointed out that she had dropped her pen. He tried to encourage her gently, asking her to push herself just a little more. Kuji watched in silence, genuinely surprised. He had never seen that expression on Yonezawa's face before. In his mind, the thought was clear. He had never seen that face on him. And in that moment he realized that perhaps, just perhaps, the person who could finally break through Yonezawa's wall of indifference was unexpectedly a girl like her. Then Yonezawa made a small gesture. He placed a small piece of candy on Hachiya's notebook and suggested she eat it to help her persevere. Hoya looked at him kindly and smiled, pleased with the gesture. She began eating with delight. However, Yonezawa noticed something unusual. Kuji's gaze made him uneasy. He asked directly what was wrong, as he had been smiling to himself for some time. Kuji remained silent. He simply replied that it was nothing, but deep down he knew the reason. It was the scent of love, a scent only a friend could recognize. Later the tension dissipated. Yuzuki presented her test results with a mixture of surprise and joy. She expressed relief that she had narrowly passed despite a close call. The group shared in her relief. Yonezawa commented that the result was very close, but a real relief nonetheless. Amidst the shared joy over the exam results, Yuzuki proposed a celebration party on Sunday, with everyone invited. This unexpected proposal surprised Yonezawa, who paused in confusion. This prompted him to ask somewhat uncertainly if he was also invited. Hachiya was clearly excited, her expression conveyed her enthusiasm. Finally, Sunday arrived. Yonezawa walked alone through the city, at a relaxed pace. As he moved forward, he reflected on how unusual it was for him to see his friends on a day off. It had been so long since he had gone out in such a manner. Suddenly, his phone vibrated. Upon checking the screen, he saw messages from Kuji and Yuzuki, both informing him of their lateness. One had just woken up, the other apologized. This was nothing unusual for Yonezawa, who had already anticipated the delays. While waiting, something caught his attention. Among the crowd, one figure stood out distinctly. Initially, he noticed a pair of tall boots, but upon looking up he froze. Standing in front of him was Hachiya. Although he recognized her immediately, he struggled to process what he was seeing. It was not that he did not know who she was, but that her appearance was radically different. She was dressed in the manner of a full-fledged Jaru, flashy clothing, bold style, and a confidence that radiated from every step. His first thought was simple: she looked older. However, as he looked more closely, he came to a more honest conclusion. She did not have an ounce of shame about her attire. After all the events of the past few days, he had nearly forgotten. But now it struck him with clarity. Hachiya-san was undoubtedly a Jaru. In that instant, he questioned whether she was truly the same person. Although only her appearance had changed, it felt as though he was meeting her for the first time. Before he could greet her, he noticed she was fixated on a restaurant. Her attention was entirely focused on that place. And in that moment, Yonezawa realized, yes, this was still Hachiya-san. He approached her calmly and called out to get her attention. Since the others were running late, he suggested they go in to eat while they waited. The decision was swift. Both agreed and entered the restaurant. Shortly after, the ramen arrived at the table. The warm, rich aroma filled the air with a comforting sensation. A waiter warned them the soup was hot, and asked them to be careful. Hachiya picked up her chopsticks naturally and prepared to eat. She placed her hands together in a respectful gesture, quietly expressing gratitude for the meal. Then, patiently she began blowing on the noodles to cool them, and slurped them calmly, although the heat was still perceptible. Yonezawa could only watch her silently as she ate. Suddenly, one noodle, pulled in by her slurping, flicked directly onto her stomach. The reaction was immediate. Hachiya let out a sharp yelp. Crying out that it burned, she squirmed in her seat, waving her hands in desperation from the heat. Yonezawa jumped up, startled. Without thinking, he searched for something useful, muttering that he needed to dry it. He grabbed a napkin and, without pausing to consider the consequences, began wiping her stomach directly. It was only after he had already done so that he realized what he was doing. Apologized immediately, saying it had been an instinctive reaction, and asked if she was all right. Hachiya lowered her gaze, visibly embarrassed. Her face was flushed, and she spoke in a quiet, serious voice, still touching her belly. She replied that it was still hot. The scene shifted gently. The ramen bowl was empty. The chopsticks and spoon rested on top. They had finished their meal. They left the restaurant, walking side by side. Yonezawa reflected in silence. It had been an awkward moment, not the kind of situation he knew how to handle. Suddenly he stopped. All this unfolded, while Hachiya subtly pressed her belly, as if the ramen and the entire scene from earlier had never happened. Yuzuki, maintaining her enthusiasm, suggested they visit the dessert buffet. This immediately altered the group's plans. Kuji, encouraged by the suggestion, readily agreed. He also recalled there were savory options and admitted he was very hungry. In contrast, Yonezawa, with an exhausted expression, confessed he felt too full to eat anything else. Hachiya, observing in silence, showed a slight sign of salivation, which indicated that despite her verbal denials, the desire for sweets was still strong. They arrived at the buffet shortly afterwards. The storefront promised a paradise of flavors, and the large table inside confirmed it. It was full of cakes, colorful parfait, mont blancs and cupcakes carefully decorated. At such a sight, Yuzuki let out an excited exclamation, while Hachiya declared that everything looked delicious. Together, they gazed at what seemed to be their dream feast. As they approached the table, Yuzuki stopped in front of the massive variety. Overwhelmed by so many options, she wondered where to begin. She thought it might be wise to start with the fruit, though she feared becoming too full too quickly. She reconsidered her decision several times, even considering sampling each type in the initial round before repeating her favorites. However, the extensive range of options only increased her indecision. At that moment, she observed that Hachiya had returned with a tray of desserts. Without hesitation, she had acted with absolute determination. Observing her, Yuzuki noted that Hachiya was once again very decisive. That confident attitude made her recall how Hachiya and Yonezawa used to act when they studied together. Driven by curiosity, Yuzuki asked Hachiya if she had not been getting along a little too well with Yonezawa recently. After observing her for another moment, she quietly suggested whether she might like him. However, before Hachiya could respond, Yuzuki laughed nervously, quickly dismissing the idea and stating it was impossible, that he was not her type. At this, Hachiya remained silent. Yuzuki looked at her closely, surprised to see her friend's face blushing, with a soft and shy expression. That was when she realized there might actually be something more. The surprise was such that she could not help but raise her voice, upon seeing that maiden-like look on Hachiya's face. That gaze left no doubt. Her suspicions were confirmed, unsettling her. Yuzuki chastised her for consuming too many desserts and attempted to persuade her to reconsider. However, she recognized that Hatu's behavior had changed precisely when Yonezawa was mentioned. Holding a large pile of sweets, Pochio remained calm, her serenity contrasting with the chaotic mountain of sugar she had gathered. Yuzuki watched her in silence, accepting that she had already realized the situation. At that moment, Kuji, seeing the mountain of food, asked in disbelief whether Hachiya's son had taken all that. Yonezawa, not particularly surprised, remarked that Hachiya was impressive. As always, Hachiya placed her hands together politely before beginning to eat. Yonezawa reminded them in a serious tone that buffets are meant to be eaten in several rounds rather than all at once. She warned that she could not finish the food in that manner. At that point, Yuzuki explained that the conversation had begun as they were discussing him. Hachiya had begun serving herself an excessive amount of food. Yonezawa, visibly surprised, asked if they were indeed talking about him. At that moment, Hachiya turned to him. With a bashful yet playful expression, she placed a finger on her cheek and replied that she would not tell him. This reaction left Yonezawa completely baffled. Naturally, he pointed out that she had cream on her face. From a distance, Yuzuki watched in silence, mesmerized by the scene, and acknowledging how dazzling Hachiya looked. Meanwhile, Yonezawa watched Hachiya closely, as she calmly licked the cream off with her tongue, remaining completely serene. Elsewhere, on the school soccer field, a group of students were playing a practice match. Kakamoto, wearing the number 10 jersey, was running hard, panting from exhaustion. From a distance, Yuzuki watched him, leaning on her arms, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Without hiding her fascination, she thought he was incredibly attractive. A short while later, from a balcony in the school building, Yuzuki and Hachiya looked down at the field. Nervously, Yuzuki commented that Hachiya already had a boyfriend. Upon hearing those words, Hachiya averted her gaze, and her cheeks flushed. Yuzuki noticed the gesture and felt something was amiss. Almost instantly, her mind filled with romantic imagery, and she realized that if things continued this way, Hachiya might be taken by Yonezawa. Driven by that conclusion, she determinedly thought that before that happened, she too had to find a boyfriend. She turned to Hachiya and her face lit up with excitement. She suggested she might ask Kakamoto-senpai for his line contact that very day, though she tried to play it off as a joke. Hachiya enthusiastically encouraged her. That encouragement was exactly what Yuzuki needed. She clenched her fist with resolve, already determined to take action after club activities. She also mentioned that women did not overthink things, they simply did them. Yonezawa happened to hear her energetic outburst and commented that it sounded somewhat aggressive. Later, Yuzuki was already hiding between the dividers in the football club's locker room, waiting for the right moment. Carefully, she applied lip gloss and put it away immediately. Her heart was pounding. She had told Hachiya to wait for her in the classroom, but now regretted not bringing her along. As she remembered the past, she mentally returned to her first year when she attended a match. Kakamoto had scored a goal, and it was at that exact moment that she fell in love with him at first sight. Later, during another game, they exchanged a few words while she was cheering him on, but it hadn't gone beyond that. Kakamoto had thanked her with a kind smile. Now thinking about it all, Yuzuki believed that he probably didn't even remember her. She observed him emerging with his friends. She rationalized that she was merely observing. She watched intently as they departed, until Kakamoto noticed something. He had forgotten to secure the locker room. One of his teammates remarked that he was an accomplished soccer player, but lacked general knowledge. Kakamoto bid farewell, promising to return shortly. From the end of the corridor, Yuzuki saw him walking alone, and recognized this as her opportunity. She pursued him, calling out loudly. Kakamoto turned around, and upon seeing her, immediately recognized her, hearing her say his name. Yuzuki, visibly embarrassed, asked if he happened to recall her. With a kind smile, he replied that he did remember her support during the games, and that he found her quite memorable. Yuzuki, overcome with nerves, struggled to maintain composure. She could not stop trembling. Kakamoto, curious, asked what she needed as it was already late. She finally gathered the courage to ask for his line. Kakamoto was surprised. At that moment, a female voice called out to him familiarly. It was Sakura, who approached with a graceful smile, informing him that she had already locked everything properly. Kakamoto blushed and smiled back. Witnessing the scene, Yuzuki was surprised. She watched it all, her mind racing, and immediately recognized Kirawa Sakura, a classmate she had always thought of as quiet, very kind and popular with both boys and girls. In that moment, she realized Sakura was the manager of the soccer club. Kakamoto let out a light laugh as he scratched his head. Yuzuki gave him a faint smile, weighed down with sadness. Then he looked back at her as if only just returning to the conversation, and apologized for getting distracted, trying to recall what they had been talking about. Kakamoto said Yuzuki's name, but she was already gone. In another corner of the school, an empty classroom remained completely still. Hachiya was sitting alone at her desk, when suddenly she turned her head upon hearing the door open. That was when Yuzuki entered. Her face clouded with sorrow on the verge of tears. She barely managed to say Hachiya's name before breaking down in an exaggerated sob, explaining through hiccups that she felt as though she had been rejected so gently it was almost imperceptible. Hachiya watched her in silence. Deeply shaken, Yuzuki confessed she had come to a bitter realization. She explained that she struggled to understand why everyone she liked always chose girls who appeared pure and innocent. Her frustration grew as she recalled the boys she had liked in the past. Calm and responsible men who inevitably ended up choosing someone completely different from her. With a mixture of anger and resignation, she concluded that in the end, all men were the same. Her thoughts spilled out in a bitter complaint, expressing her frustration that everyone seemed to fall for the same kind of demure girls, while she remained invisible. As she spoke, Hachiya continued listening silently, a bead of sweat running down her cheek. Yuzuki let out a heavy sigh, resigned, and went on to say that one could not compete against a modest girl. Her face shadowed. She muttered that girls like her did not seem to stand a chance. She expressed her confusion about the constant rejection, and questioned why boys could not fall for someone like her. The silence stretched on, and Hachiya remained still. Yuzuki forced a smile, and said with a hint of sadness behind a cheerful expression that perhaps it would be better to cease being a music enthusiast. Her smile widened, but her eyes reflected a deep shadow. Hachiya did not respond immediately. Instead, she stared at her intently. Suddenly, she stood up abruptly from her seat, and without a word grasped Yuzuki's cheeks firmly, leaving her completely stunned. The two stood face to face in the quiet classroom. Hachiya looked at her with determination and absolute calm, and told her she was beautiful. Then she held Yuzuki's face gently with both hands and leaned in. Yuzuki, frozen in shock, opened her eyes wide, which sparkled intensely. Hachiya then gave her cheeks a soft shake, bringing her back to reality. Still dazed, Yuzuki thought that in the end, she only had Hachiya. She suddenly clung to her and hugged her tightly, breaking into tears again as she confessed that she did not want Yonezawa to take her away. Hachiya froze in surprise, unsure how to react. In a nearby hallway, Yonezawa sneezed and blamed the pollen, unaware that someone was speaking about him. The following morning at his apartment, the television was left on as he ate. Suddenly, his older sister appeared, took the remote without hesitation, and changed the channel. Yonezawa protested nervously, stating he was watching that program. She smiled confidently, and replied that as she contributed financially to the household, she had the right to choose what to watch. She also added that young people should hurry off to school and focus on their studies. Then she sat down relaxed with a drink in hand, visibly tense. Yonezawa asked if she had come from a night shift, and told her not to drink alcohol in the morning. She dismissed it as an adult nutritional supplement, and with a teasing smile, claimed that since she did not smoke, she was a great person. Annoyed, Yonezawa walked away, sarcastically remarking that she was indeed very great. Later he seriously reflected on this way of judging young people, and the arbitrary molds they are forced into. He realized that when someone brought up money, there was little else to say, and recalled that his sister was only in her first year. As he walked through a nearby park, he noticed a girl sitting alone near a swing. He thought she might be hot, and wondered what was wrong. Perhaps she had a stomachache, as she appeared somewhat pensive. From above, the park ground offered a peculiar scene. Written in white sugar was a large message in the shape of a heart that read, "Love and peace." Tiny ants crawled across the lines, tracing the letters and their outlines. Meanwhile, Hachiya tilted a sugar packet slowly, allowing its contents to fall onto the ground. Not far away, Yonezawa watched the scene in disbelief as he saw the ants gathering around the sugar. He thought someone must be attracting them on purpose to form a heart, until he clearly spotted Hachiya still holding the packet. Her expression was completely serious. A deep discomfort settled in immediately, as if he had just witnessed something he was not meant to see. Suddenly, Hachiya's eyes widened and she stepped back abruptly, losing her balance just as the ants began to crawl up her body. She attempted to shake them off, but found it futile. Several ants moved across her clothes, visibly causing her to panic. She hunched over awkwardly, frantically brushing them off, while Yonezawa stood frozen, nervously fixated on the thought that the ants were reaching her torso. Finally, Hachiya turned around, embarrassed, glancing over her shoulder. A few ants were still visible on her clothes. In a low, tense voice, she asked him to help her remove them. After assisting her, Yonezawa casually asked if they were all gone now. Hachiya, now calmer, simply adjusted her clothes discreetly, without saying much more. Yonezawa glanced at her sideways, deep in thought. An unexpected comparison began to take shape. Hachiya seemed like a child. He lowered his gaze, caught up in that reflection. In that moment, he realized he was judging her through a rigid lens, the same way his older sister did. He realized he was repeating the same pattern of thinking. Breaking the silence, Yonezawa reminded her that they would be late for school if they did not hurry. Hachiya gently waved goodbye to the ants as if they were old friends. Watching her leave, he smiled. It was clear Hachiya was still the same,